Hello, Jimmy. How are you?
Sorry, I couldn't get unmuted because of the recording dialogue modal.
No worries.
Yeah. This just to let you know. I mean, this meeting happens at like 7 o'clock my time in the evening, so sometimes I just can't make it because I got other family commitments.
Yeah, totally understand. It's great that you're joining us from time to time.
Yeah, I'm not sure how great it is. I'm not sure how much value I'm adding, but I'll try to join when I can.
Yeah, Akash and I were talking previously that we are going through some of the policy changes, and we're like, oh, this will be interesting to Jimmy.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. Share. This is the recordings from last week. I'll remove this. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep, can see it.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I think we have a small group today. We'll see if Sajay joins soon. And Teja have let me know that she has a conflict. I can get started with the PRs. The first one that we have in the list, oh, Nathan is here, admit. Yeah, the PRs from last week, the loading of multiple certificates from for notary verification certificates from a directory. Teja have signed off on this. Akashi left a new comment. I just need to get I'll ping Shiwei again to see if we have additional comment. Akashi has responded to the email that if the home replacement fails, we would just fail later. Is that fine with you?
Yep, that makes sense. Yep, I think it's good to go.
Great, thanks. I'll make sure to do like one round of verification before I merge. Okay. Yeah, otherwise I've added all the unit testing for each scenario where we have like symbolic link, multiple symbolic link in the test cases. I think we have some good coverage there. Maybe the other item we could do, Akash, is can we run the unit test on PR submission?
Yeah, I think so. I think we already do that though.
Oh, do we?
We build, yeah, in the build step, it's building and then it's running the unit tests. So
okay.
Yeah, it should run this as well then. Yep.
Great. Yeah, maybe I'll check like just to submit a commit to fail the unit test just to validate that this is checking for that.
Okay. Yep. Sounds good.
Sounds
good.
I
had that set up at one point.
Okay.
So yeah.
Thanks, Nathan. The next PR, Akash had an improvement on the authentication cache. Akash, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so this one's not a huge change, but basically this is to address the scenario where we might cache credentials after fetching them that may expire or may fail after a certain period of time, and that might be because the user changed permissions or revoked a token, etc. So before that, there was no way to force a refresh of the cache. If the credential was already in the cache, then and it failed the first time, even on the second time, it would continue to fail because it would try to grab the same faulty credentials from the cache. So this just basically, if if there's any sort of authentication or any error in any of the registry operations, it'll kick the credential out of the cache so that the next retry, it'll go through the whole process of grabbing the credential again and then repopulating the cache if all of the other operations are successful. So, yep. And I think it's basically ready to go. Got sign off from Susan. Yeah.
Yeah. I can merge this right now if no one have any additional comments.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, let me merge this. Okay, that's done. The next PR is fixing inconsistent payload. I added a comment about, since we have this error scenario where if we didn't specify, well, if it was omitted, then it becomes nil. Is there a unit test we can add?
Yeah, we can add a unit test. This is a util method. So it actually is all the way down at the point where we're printing the actual encoded JSON of the verify report object. So that encoding process actually has the small inconsistency in it, which was causing the default is success false value to be omitted. So currently we don't have any unit tests for that util class, but I can look into adding that and then seeing maybe adding an encoding unit test for that. So.
And this payload is the payload from the verification.
Yes, so it's basically when the whole verification executor finishes, it generates a bunch of verifier reports. Each report corresponds to one of the reference artifacts that it's checking, if it's a signature, etc. So the actual payload that it sends to the gatekeeper, that is consistent, but when we print it out, we want to print the whole report into the logs itself. We actually encode the JSON, use the JSON encoder library to encode the actual object and then print that out. And that encoding portion, there was a small issue where it would omit one of the fields in that process.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this one's a pretty minor change. So.
Thank you, Akash. Yeah, once you push the unit test, I will be able to sign off on that.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, the next PR, since we've recently added the workload identity support for authenticating to private registries, I've also updated the CSI driver to use workload identity instead of pod identity. So then the customer will only have to do one set of setup. So I've added this client ID to the secret provider class and removed the pod identity flag. And I see in some other location, for example, the helper, how do you pronounce a TPL file? Anyone?
Template? Maybe.
Template?
I'm not sure.
Okay. In some template file, like I see that we're already reading in service account names. I guess the idea is like the developer can integrate with their own deployment file. So I would just, in my change, I've also just kind of assumed, like followed the same path where we have service account dot name. But I think I also need the secret account dot namespace, right? I'll add that in later.
Yes, yeah, you might need to add the namespace. Otherwise, it just assumes the default namespace. So.
Yeah. Then I wonder in here, like when we, like this script here, if it says, if we want to create a new service account for Ratify, is this to define a service account? What does this actually do. This just creates a service account, but we don't deploy Ratify with this account.
Not sure. Yeah, I need to take a look closer at it, where it's actually being used. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we can have another look together offline.
Okay.
Yeah.
So are you asking if the service account is being, I mean, the service account is not being used to do the actual deployment, right? I mean, it's being used it's being used by Ratify, right? To reach out to using the workload identity to reach out to services outside the cluster, right?
Yes. So I just want to bring up my PR again. Let me. So Jimmy, the question here is so for us to use workload identity, the pod must have the service account name specified here in the deployment file.
Yeah.
And
or you can inject it.
Oh, okay. Or we can inject it. And the question is, what is this helper method trying to do?
Oh, okay.
Because previously, okay, let me just quickly search for this value. Like I didn't see the service account being used in the deployment file.
I mean, ideally, it should be part of the manifested for the deployment resource or whatever is creating the pod.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 dots on the side. So
Thanks.
and you can open the file.
Yep. View file. Right. There's no other usage of the service account created by this helper class. Nathan, do you know what this service account is for?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it, so.
It's possible it's left over. Maybe it was used originally somewhere. I'm not sure. But yeah,
Okay.
we can follow up and see. Maybe we can just remove it. What happens if we remove it?
Yeah. Well, because we don't have this value.
Yeah.
So it's probably not getting executed right now anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I was just wondering. And if we had the binding, like the developer have to pre-configure the binding between the workload identity and the service account, right? Like if they want to use workload identity, creating a service account on the fly doesn't work.
Yeah, because it requires the actual binding of the service account to the workload identity using the OIDC thing. If you remember, you have to.
Yeah, the issuer.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of telling Azure, hey, this service account in this namespace will be using this identity.
Mm-hmm.
So if I understand it correctly, based on what we do, there is an OIDC IDP issuer basically stamped onto the cluster or associated with the cluster. And that is going to handle the identity. And then you have to add, I guess, annotations on your Surface account to tell it what principal you want it to use, usually like a role or something. Is that how your workload identity is working?
Let me bring up the steps of workload identity.
Or
Yep.
I mean, you could point me to it. I don't want to, take us down a rabbit hole. I mean,
Akash actually written a doc with like the top level steps of how to configure this.
Okay.
So let me just go to his doc. ORAS auth provider, where option number 2, configuring Azure workload identity.
Okay.
So these are the exact steps. So we create a role assignment on this application ID.
Okay.
And then it's a REST call to a Microsoft Graph API specifying the service account, which is in the subject field of the payload.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we do it a little differently, but I mean, it's very similar as far as there's a principal that's associated with the service account, and then that service account obviously gets associated with a pod, and the permissions come from that principal. So yeah.
Yeah. So all the key concept is the same.
Yeah,
Role
it's
assignment.
the same, but I know nothing about Azure, so yeah, I should probably read up on this.
Yeah, great. Let us know if you have any
Oh,
questions.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for taking the time to show this to me.
No problem. Thanks for writing up the doc, Akash.
Yep.
Cool. Next item. Next step on the gatekeeper timeout. Akash, do you want to tell us some updates?
Give us some good news, Akash.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is good news. Susan, if you want to click on the link. So I filed a issue with them and explained to them that, look, the initial reasoning that you had reduced the timeout from 5 to 3 may not actually apply because the issue with leader election seems to have been mitigated in the latest since Kubernetes 1.20. So I pointed them to all the different pieces of code and the issues that show that it's actually been resolved. And it seems like they are warming up to the idea, and they also agree that maybe the issue doesn't exist anymore, but they're having some concerns about, can we assume everyone's on 1.20 and higher? Also, does this affect other libraries who might have pegged their timeout on Gatekeeper's default timeout? So I guess there are other concerns with that. However, my interpretation was that if they're acknowledging that the original reason they had lowered the timeout no longer applies, could we on our Gatekeeper chart in the meantime comfortably override their 3 seconds and increase it to 5 or maybe even 7 seconds?
Yeah, I mean, I like that. I like that plan. I think we should probably document their concerns. I'm assuming that neither Max nor Rita gave you any indication of what other services may be dependent on that smaller window. Okay. I mean, but I like your approach. I like we should be able to increase this window. The caveats are it could interfere with other services, but the problem is we don't know what those are yet. And so maybe there's some discovery that needs to happen there, but I like the way you're thinking.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I see it from their perspective, considering Gatekeeper is a much larger project. Yeah, in the meantime, I might just send out a PR and upgrade it on our end, and then I'll keep up with them and follow up and see like where they are in the decision-making process for this issue.
So I think we should probably look at a burn-in type testing on this as well to see, as we get closer to testing this thing out. I mean, one of the things we'll need to test is our new settings in the window to make sure that we're not introducing any non-deterministic behavior, I guess, is what I think it's what they're afraid of, is that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Jimmy, can you add more? Can you tell us what sort of testing we should do?
I need to do some more research around what their major concerns are. I mean, the issue is we should be able to increase this window. I think they kind of feel the same way based on what I'm reading in their comments. However, their concerns are, do we introduce breaking changes to existing libraries that have already based their response baseline on the window of Gatekeeper? I don't know off the top of my head what exact policies we should running through this. I don't know yet, so I'll have to look more into it. Maybe I can try reaching out to Max or Rita in the Gatekeeper thing, Gatekeeper Slack channel, and try to figure out what their concerns are, or maybe give me an indication of how they're testing this. Yeah, probably the first thing is to figure out how they're doing it. I personally don't think it's going to be a big deal, especially since, you know, the fix in 1.2.0. That being said, I don't know what you all do. I don't know what GCP does. But we try to get customers upgraded as soon as we can. That being said, I'm sure there are plenty of customers that are still out there on 1.19 or earlier versions. So,
Jimmy, do you think we can make a change in Ratify to override that timeout?
it should be part of the. Is it not part of the? It should be part of the chart already, right? That they.
Yeah, we can do that easily. I think the question is, should we do it? Are we at the point where we can do that?
I don't know why we wouldn't be.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're running on a cluster that's already 1.20, then to me it makes sense that we make this change and see what characteristics it changes, if any. If we see a non-deterministic, issue, or we see a repeatable issue for that matter, then we take action from there. But we don't know what that is yet. I think we should change it and see what happens.
Yep, I'm in favor of that as well.
Yeah, feel free to submit the PR, Akash.
Okay, sounds good.
Oh, yes, and I also went to the Helm dev meeting because previously we were evaluating if we could hook up to the Helm hooks, the pre-install step. So they don't have any concerns with us using the pre-install step if needed. And they just advised that if it was a pre-install step, it should be a job so that we can wait on the completion of the job. And our job would be just to cache the Ratify result. And they have a timeout of 15 minutes by default, which is plenty of time for us to get the signatures and produce a verifier report. But that's just if we ever need to explore that route. So I've documented the finding in the discussion of the timeout issue.
Yeah, I think the short poll in the tent is going to be gatekeeper. I don't think we're going to run into issues other than that. And my biggest concern is all of this is going to be new plumbing. So we don't know yet what the performance characteristics are going to be for the multiple calls. So.
Mm-hmm. Akash, with the override of the timeout, maybe we should also update the README doc to say minimum Kubernetes version 1.2.
Yes, yeah, we should add that as well. I'll update the doc.
Thanks. Do you know what version is the latest right now? If we created
1.23, I believe.
Is that what you guys are at? Or is that what? Are we just looking at the upstream tree? Yeah, because 1.24 is not yet released, right?
Yeah, 1.24 is not yet released. 1.23.6, I think, is upstream latest, if I'm not mistaken. And then AKS probably supports, I think maybe private preview is 1.23 higher, I believe.
Yeah, we just released 1.22 today or yesterday or today.
Okay.
Because of the issues with etcd 3.5, and I think we've actually looked at using etcd. I think we're using etcd 3.4 actually in 1.22. So,
Jimmy, what's the deprecation schedule for EKS?
I mean, it's publicly available. Let me look real quick I'll look at it while you guys go move on with something else, but it might take me a few minutes to find it.
Thanks. Yeah, feel free to just link us to the doc in the chat and we can read about it later.
Yeah, the one thing that we don't do is we don't like to give exact dates because things change. Speaking with not the least of which was this time around with 1.22, we ran into issues with etcd ran into issues, and we had to not use the latest one and go back to the 3.4. But some of the upstream thing we have no control over, so that's why we try not to give dates.
I see. Next item, Akash, you were looking at the policy provider, executor policies last week.
Yeah, so I think the conversation we had last week was we should prioritize the ability for a user to specify certain signatures that must exist, and then return an overall verifier result of true or false based off of whether a notary signature or SBOM or whatever the user specifies actually exists. So a subject may have multiple artifacts associated, and we may verify, and all of them may come out to be true, but we might be looking for a very specific artifact to actually verify and for it to actually be an overall success. So last week we saw that there was one issue with how the executor was handling reference types, which caused the overall verify result to not work correctly. That had to do with the reference type filtering kind of blocking the overall verify result. But that kind of led to a larger conversation on how should we actually handle the executor policy design. The executor is responsible for coordinating all of the different operations with the different plugins. So from pulling from the refer store all the refers to coordinating with the verifier plugin, and then extracting the results and then returning the overall verify result. And currently the overall verify result, the policy associated with that is handled by the executor itself. It has to determine kind of whether it should return true or false. But ideally that should be the policy provider's domain. The policy provider should basically take in the final verifier reports that are sent from the verifier, and then however it's configured, it can determine what the overall truth should be. So that kind of based off of that, I started to think about how we can, what are we currently using? What is our current provider, policy provider? And then what can we add to kind of support this overall verify success implementation, and then also consider maybe an external policy provider like using OPA, for example. So currently what we rely upon is a configuration-based policy provider. So in our Ratify configuration, there's a policy section where you can define, the only thing right now that we support is you can define the artifact verification policy section, which is basically a map of you provide us an artifact type and then provide the policy, which is any or all. So for the artifact type, if it's any, then it requires any signature of that type that verifies as true is enough for us to satisfy the full constraint for that artifact type. And for basically all of the artifacts of that type that are found and verified must be true for it to satisfy the constraint. And if you specify those, for example, in this scenario, if you specify all three of those artifact types with their corresponding policy type, all of them must be satisfied in order for the overall result to return as true or false back to Gatekeeper.
So this is a policy decisioning point that we're
Yes.
talking about here. Where is
Yes.
this happening? Where is this decision point?
So this decision point is actually happening in the executor. So after all of the verifier is called on all of the different reference artifacts, and we get a list of basically verifier reports where each item is the result of verifying a specific reference type on the subject. We might get multiple, we might get 10, just the number according to however many artifacts are associated with the subject. After we get that list, then we need to basically come up with the consensus answer to those reports. And that's where this policy engine provider takes over. It would basically take all of those reports, and then it determines based off of these specific verification policy set whether it's met all of those requirements, and then returns an overall yes or no. So that's kind of the point we're looking at.
So the evaluation happens down in the executor, and then what gets passed back to the gatekeeper policy is just a Boolean?
Yes. So what gets back is basically a Boolean. It's true, yes, it's all verified, or false, no, it's not. Gatekeeper doesn't actually do any of its own policy application at that level.
Okay.
Yeah. So so currently the policy provider has its own API that was defined. So if you scroll down, Susan, to the current supported methods. So right now the API, the provider implements 3 basic methods. So the first one, verify needed. The intent is that it can be used to verify in the beginning if the subject provided should actually be verified. Should we continue with the whole process, or does it not follow some sort of specification that could be defined? Actually, Susan, could you open the link? I've linked one at the top of the document that has the other. Yeah.
So earlier you were talking about maybe you would surface this up higher. Is that what you're saying? Or change
Basically,
the policy type?
Yeah. So basically right now the executor it manually does this artifact policy application. You're not calling the provider exactly to do this. It's tightly coupled with the executor. Ideally, the policy provider should be handling anything policy related, and the executor just calls the provider to get the final decision. So yeah, if you scroll down to the bottom, so there's this concept of overall verify success on line 124. So we're doing the actual checking here, where ideally we should be offloading that to
a policy engine.
Yeah, to the policy engine, and the policy engine just takes the verify reports as the input, and the policy engine, however it's configured, decides what the final result is. It shouldn't be the executor and Ratify doing it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we're doing. Yeah, I agree with you. It seems like we're doing. Well, we have 2 policy decisioning points, right?
Mhm.
One of them is up inside Gatekeeper, and it's really just artificial, if you ask me. I mean, we're getting a Boolean sent back to Gatekeeper based on an actual policy decision that's happening down inside the executor. So I guess I didn't realize that's how it was working, but I agree. I think that either I'd like to see a policy engine involved that's not tightly coupled to the rest of the implementation.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to need for it to be truly extensible. Otherwise, this is going to be hard to, if a user has specific policies that they want to define, it's not very easy to do it in the current setup.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if we're going to run into, it's going to be really hard to, extend it and support it.
Yeah.
So your thoughts are bubble the whole thing up to Gatekeeper, or attach another policy, management to that decisioning point?
Yeah, so the reason we can't bubble it up to Gatekeeper is because the actual policy is interleaved throughout the executor's processes. So it's not just at the end it's making a final decision, it's throughout the process. So for example, if one of the policies that it uses is, should it continue if it has failed one of the artifacts, the reports that's come in has failed? Should we continue verifying all the other artifacts, or should we just immediately return failure? That can't kind of bubble up to Gatekeeper, because Gatekeeper would only get the final results. So that's why, like, what we're suggesting is have another plugin, a provider plugin, basically, kind of how we have refer stores, how we had authentication providers. We now have a policy provider plugin framework where you can specify what the provider you want to use in the actual configuration. And then if that's your configuration-based policy provider, well, then that's just kind of what we support now. All of the policies determined by what you put inside the configuration. So if you have artifact verification policies, then you define them in the configuration. Or if you wanted to use an external policy engine like OPA, then you would basically say, hey, I want to use the OPA provider, and here's the OPA, here's the Rego file that you're going to use. So the OPA provider implementation would implement the same policy provider API, and for each of those, it would just query the engine for the specific functions that it needs to do.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, the way that I would be leaning would be probably something like OPA.
Yeah.
That we would embed using the Go API for OPA.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that I think because we already have configuration-based support to a certain extent, we could make the config-based its own policy provider, and that it's kind of already is the case, but it's like the sole provider right now anyway. And then we would build an extra OPA provider if the user wants to use the OPA provider, and allow for that plugin to be used instead. So,
is there a use case where Ratify would just produce the verifier reports, and then more upstream, there are more Rego to go through the report and make a final result?
I mean, that's the whole case where what we return to Gatekeeper right now is really just a Boolean. Instead, we could return the full verifier report, and then the Gatekeeper Rego would be a lot richer, and it would determine on its end how it would work. And the problem is that then we can't have any support for any of the interleaving policy decisions that happen in the executor itself. So.
Yeah, it's like a mutually exclusive issue, really, or is it? Because
maybe not. I'm not sure. Maybe we could have the option for both, but if you are using the OPA engine here anyway, I don't know, does it make sense to have two Rego files where you're doing parsing for both?
Well, so what makes, I don't know, to me, what makes sense is where the policy decisioning points need to be. So for instance, if I'm already up against a 3 to 5 second window where I'm making all these calls and I got to get back to Gatekeeper, and Gatekeeper has to get back to, the validating call that came in from whatever, deployment workload or whatever, it would make sense to me that I would have the decision, the policy engine as close to the decision point as possible. If I were in this very tight window, which is what it sounds like we are. So now we're talking about making the calls and then using, right now we have embedded logic, right? But we're thinking about, can we make it extensible so someone can change that embedded logic to use a policy solution for those policy decisioning points? And what is that going to introduce as far as latencies? So I don't think it's as simple as we already got OPA Gatekeeper. Let's just call OPA Gatekeeper for these policy decisions. I think it's more about the Netflix model when they started using OPA, which was, for authentication and authorization, or for authorization, they would put the OPA, the multiple OPAs, they'd put them out there right at the decisioning point where their services were. And then they would update the policies on a regular basis from a remote central repository. But the decisioning point always had an OPA right next to it because of the need to authorize immediately or fail authorization immediately. So I think we're in that same bucket. I don't think we're going to be calling a centralized. I mean, we might. I mean, I don't. It doesn't sound right to me at first. It sounds more like we're going to make an API call to a specific embedded OPA that has, one or multiple policies for that particular decisioning point. Is that something you were thinking about, or am I just?
Yeah, no, that's fair. Honestly, I hadn't even considered the latency part of it, but yeah, that is a very fair point.
And Nathan and Sajay, do you have any feedback?
Yeah, not really anything constructive, no.
I don't know where we would have to land in terms of timing for this one, right? But what's the general direction at this point, Akash, that you're planning to take? Because we had discussed about kind of like exposing the ability to at least require one signature, right? That's the priority that we wanted to kind of go after.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that needs to be like the first priority, but to get to that point, and then also have the option open for adding an OPA provider would be one, add kind of the same framework that we've applied for refer stores and auth providers, where we use factories to create and register the different providers. So in our case, we would have one provider currently, which is the config-based provider. And then we would use the existing configuration-based artifact verification policies, which is specified in the config, and then use that to determine what signature has to be on the subject and must be verified in order for it to pass. So the first part would be to set up the factories, that's just scaffolding stuff. The second part would be to convert or update slightly the existing config policy provider to accommodate the new provider framework. And then the third, and maybe in the future, would be we add the OPA provider. That would be secondary to the first two, if that makes sense. That's what I was thinking. I don't know if that's reasonable or not. So.
How does that impact? It sounds like it negatively impacts MVP, right? I mean, going forward with the first iteration of this, we have the configured policies that we need right now, right? They're just not extensible.
Yes. So if we fix it will work, the scenario that the first version that Sajay is talking about, but there's one bug that's blocking it from working. We could just work on fixing that issue and then return back to this. But if we want to at least incrementally build towards a more extensible solution, then I think we could do a little bit of work now to build the provider extensibility, and then maybe just onboard what we have right now as a provider, and then get the first part working.
Yeah, so what we're saying is basically take the executor logic out and
take the executor logic out, add factory to create this whole plugin based system for the provider, but currently only support one configuration provider for a policy configuration provider, and it will have the existing it'll only have the functionality where you can specify the artifact type to the policy, which is any or all. So kind of what we have right now, but at least build on the framework for if we want to add OPA provider in the future. If that's not really concerned, then maybe we can just not do any of this and just focus on the quick fix to it. But I just thought if this is a consideration, and Teja had also written both of these approaches in her original document, so I thought we'd explore this as well. So.
I mean, the executor was meant to be generic. It's just a placeholder for some kind of shelling out somewhere. And if we consider that you want to unblock through just enabling require artifact as a stopgap implementation, right? Like of a provider, I think that's okay. And then you get an extensibility point to say even a complex, if it's not OPA, you can even do outbound calls if you want to, but maybe not in the Kubernetes case, right? Like if there's something else, and that's okay.
I mean, OPA is not the only one. You know, there's plenty of them out there. I like the idea of making it extensible. I guess my only concern would be how much work is it going to be, and can we do it in such a way that we can reuse the logic we currently have, but also we've started laying the groundwork for changes that are not as significant going forward that would allow us to more extensibility. I guess I'm kind of beating around the bush that I don't want to derail what the work you've already done, I guess. But you're the one that knows the most about this. So
actually I've already started doing the work.
I was wondering, that was my next question.
We've been thinking about it for quite some time. That's why.
Well, I wanted to see how feasible it would be. So I would say I think it can be done. And then I'll have something out, and then if we're not happy with it, we can just scrap it and go back to just fixing the issue. But I just think it'd be nicer to remove it from the executor and then build a good provider foundation. So if we want to onboard other policy engines in the future, like OPA or whatever, it leaves the door open. So
sounds good.
That sounds fine to me, especially since you've already started working on it in your copious spare time.
I have a question, Akash. In general, like outside of Ratify, if people say any, does it mean 0 to many, or does it usually mean 1 to n?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I got confused by that too. Does any, so any right now as it's implemented means you need at least 1. All is obviously pretty self-explanatory, but yeah.
Okay, so is it right now, there is no constraint on any, right? Because today if the image only has an SBOM but not a signature, we don't actually check the requirement for notary signature.
Yeah, that's because of the whole reference type issue that we were discussing with Deja. There's this weird checking that's going on there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think that any is an actual use case, because what customer would want to kind of like see that I don't have a signature, or I have an SPOM, or any of these types. So it's good for if you just think of it from a language and a policy syntax, it might make sense, but from a use case, I don't see how that would be used by anybody. That's my feedback on that.
But Sajay, it's okay to name it any for meaning at least 1? Or should we call it at least 1?
So I think we should avoid non-deterministic, right? So
right.
It's just like using the latest tag for a container image.
Oh, God.
I would stay away from that as much as possible. And so that's kind of what this sounds like to me, is that we need to be more precise on what any means, even if we take it completely out, right? So
yeah, that makes sense to me. I was actually suggesting we yank any away, and if we only support all, that's good enough. And the point of plugging it in is to it's a little verbose, because yes, you have one artifact and you say all, that means it's but maybe you can say I want an SPOM and a signature, which might be also okay. or I want to scan results in a signature, which is also all. So by default, maybe just sticking with all might be the thing because of the verbosity, but or maybe we could refactor the JSON model also to make it say required artifacts and just put a list over there. That's also another possibility, and just remove the operator altogether, because moving to the OPA provider might be the way going forward. So I would, yeah, I'm okay if we want to take out any also.
Yep, sounds good. That's our last item on the list, I think. Sajay, do you have any updates from like additional requirements that you previously talked about? I think the Azure policy, do they have additional requirements for us?
Not right now. I think they're still kind of evaluating it. They hit the same problems. The one update, I think yesterday, I merged the change for fetch reference, which is the one single API call to get the manifest into Auras. So if you can update that, that'll reduce one more call to the registry. So we're kind of like making good progress on that. That's on the side, but overall, I think we've, at least for now, we have some path forward and we don't have to redefine the entire thing going forward as well. So I'm just happy that we didn't have to write so much to solve this one problem. At least for now, we'll find out along the way.
Great. Sajay, do you know when Eric will be back? Like we forgot the day. Like we know it's
Yeah, in about a
sometime
couple,
in April.
I think 3 weeks. Yeah, he should be here in about April 20th, I think.
20th. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's
All right.
everything today. Anything else?
No, thanks for keeping this going. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. I'll see you next week.
All right. Bye.
All right. See y'all.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Good job, Akash.
Thanks.